Imagine you are like incredibly stressed out. Maybe you're stuck in this massive gridlock traffic. You're already 10 minutes late for a really crucial meeting.
Oh, the absolute worst feeling.
Right. And your phone is just continuously vibrating against your leg with these urgent emails, and you can physically feel your heart hammering against your ribs.
Yeah, you're in full fight or flight mode at that point.
Exactly. And then a well-meaning friend in the passenger seat looks over at you and says, "Hey, just breathe."
Oh, man. I mean, it is the ultimate pop culture cliche.
Yeah.
And in that specific moment, it is probably the most deeply frustrating piece of advice you could possibly receive.
Yeah, you just want to scream that breathing isn't going to somehow magically clear this traffic or, write your emails for you.
Right? It feels totally useless.
But setting that frustration aside for a second, here's a really strange question. Why does sitting perfectly still, doing absolutely nothing, and focusing on something as basic as your breath actually physically change the shape of your brain?
And that right there, that is the central mystery we are looking at today. Because, for a long time, the idea that a subjective mental state could alter physical hardware
Yeah.
sounded like, well, magic.
It sounds like sci-fi.
It does.
Mm.
But as we dig into the research today, we find out it is actually pure biology.
Which is wild. So, welcome to the Deep Dive Lab. Today, our mission is to uncover the true science of how mindfulness affects the human body. And we are looking at a massive stack of sources to do it.
Yeah, we have a really great variety of material today.
We really do. We've got landmark neuroimaging studies from the journal Psychiatry Research. We have critical psychological reviews like this famous paper called Mind the Hype, and even some cultural critiques, including a book called Mindfulness.
Which is such a great title.
So good. So we are going to explore the biological reality of neuroplasticity while also investigating the surprising kind of hidden dark side to the multi-billion-dollar wellness industry.
Yeah, there's a lot to get through.
Okay, let's unpack this because we need to look at where this scientific mystery actually began.
Right, so to understand why this was such a profound mystery to begin with, you really have to look at the context of Western science for, well, most of the 20th century.
The old school way of thinking.
Exactly. Up until just a few decades ago, the prevailing scientific consensus was that the adult human brain was relatively fixed. Like the assumption was that once you reached adulthood, your brain structure was static.
You're just stuck with what you've got.
Pretty much. You had a certain number of neurons, and the only change you could really expect was just a slow decline as you aged.
Which is a super depressing thought, honestly.
It really is. And along with that, stress was viewed primarily as just a psychological issue.
Right.
It was considered something happening entirely in your mind, just a feeling, not a physical ailment that was actively damaging your tissue.
And as for meditation itself, with all its roots in ancient Hindu, Taoist, and Buddhist traditions, mainstream Western society mostly viewed it as either a purely religious practice or like a hippie counterculture trend.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't seen as clinical medicine by the mainstream establishment.
But then modern life just accelerated. Society entered what researchers often call a VUCA world.
Oh, right, VUCA, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Exactly. And as the pace of life sped up so dramatically, the cracks in our biological armor really started to show. Stress became a very real physical epidemic.
We started seeing these measurable spikes in cardiovascular disease, chronic inflammation, and just severe burnout across the board.
Yeah, scientists realized that chronic stress was basically flooding the body with cortisol, which was actually weathering the brain and the immune system, like physically damaging them.
Which brings up a fascinating structural question, right? If the environment is physically damaging a brain, could a mental practice physically repair it?
It's basically like asking if a software update, changing your conscious thoughts through meditation could literally solder new connections onto the computer's physical motherboard.
I love that analogy. That's exactly what they were wondering. But the challenge was figuring out how to measure that.
Because how do you quantify the physical impact of non-doing?
Right. So the framework for answering that really began in the late 1970s with a clinical program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, or MBSR.
Okay, MBSR.
Yeah, it was developed by John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And what he did was he took the core observational techniques from traditional contemplative practices, but stripped away the specific religious and cultural frameworks.
To make it more accessible.
Exactly. He created this standardized, secular 8-week clinical intervention.
But even with MBSR standardized like that, the real biological proof didn't arrive until decades later, right? Because we had to wait for modern MRI technology to advance.
Yeah, the tech had to catch up. We needed to be able to actually see inside a living, thinking human brain with enough precision to measure microscopic structural changes.
Which brings us to a massive turning point. The technology finally caught up to the ancient practices, allowing us to see the actual mechanism of change.
It's so cool.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to dive straight into the landmark study from our stack that shifted this entire paradigm.
Oh, the 2011 paper?
Yes, the 2011 paper published in the journal Psychiatry Research, Neuroimaging. The research was conducted by Dr. Britta Holzel, Sarah W. Lazar, and their colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School.
Heavy hitters.
For sure. And what stands out to me here is just how tightly controlled this experiment was. So they recruited 16 healthy, meditation-naive people,
Right, meaning these individuals had never meditated a single day in their lives.
which is a crucial detail.
It's the most critical detail because if you study monks who have meditated for, I don't know, 10,000 hours, you don't actually know if the meditation changed their brains or if people with those specific, naturally Zen brain structures are simply more drawn to becoming monks in the first place.
Oh, like a chicken and egg scenario.
Exactly. So by starting with complete novices, the researchers could isolate the effect of the practice itself. It's literally like taking your brain to the gym for the first time.
Okay, so they put these 16 complete novices through an intense 8-week MBSR program. And we should clarify, this wasn't just casually listening to a 10-minute app before bed.
Oh, no, not at all.
It involved 2.5-hour weekly group meetings, 1 full-day silent retreat, and 45 minutes of daily audio-guided practice doing things like body scanning and mindful yoga.
It was a real commitment.
Hmm.
And then they compare these participants to a 17-person waitlist control group.
Right. And before the 8 weeks began, and right after it ended, they scanned everyone's brains using this highly precise technique called voxel-based morphometry, or VBM.
VBM, which is just fascinating technology.
I found the mechanics of VBM so cool. For anyone listening who isn't a radiologist, a voxel is basically a 3-dimensional pixel.
Like in a video game.
Yeah, exactly. So VBM takes the MRI scan and divides the brain into thousands of these tiny 3D cubes. And then it measures the exact density of gray matter inside every single microscopic cube.
And just a quick reminder, gray matter is the actual neuronal cell bodies, the dendrites, and the synapses.
The hardware.
Yeah, the tissue responsible for actually processing information. And the findings from this were just groundbreaking. In only 8 weeks, the meditators' brains physically grew.
Wow.
The VBM scans showed statistically significant increases in gray matter density in several key regions, while the control group showed no such changes at all.
Okay, let's break down where that growth actually happened, because the specific brain regions explain so much about how this works.
Yeah, let's do it.
First, they saw increased density in the left hippocampus. Now, I know the hippocampus is our primary center for learning and memory, but I am really struggling to understand why doing nothing but focusing on a breath builds memory. Like, what is the biological mechanism happening there?
Right, it seems counterintuitive. But it basically comes down to cortisol and neuroplasticity. See, the hippocampus is heavily populated with receptors for stress hormones.
Okay.
So when you are chronically stressed, that excess cortisol actually causes the dendritic pathways in the hippocampus to shrink and literally atrophy.
Oh, wow. So stress is physically shrinking your memory center.
Yes. But when the subjects practice mindfulness, they lowered their baseline sympathetic nervous system arousal. They essentially turned down the cortisol fire hose.
So they stop the damage.
Exactly. And in that safer chemical environment, the brain engages in synaptogenesis, meaning it sprouts new neural connections.
Yeah.
The hippocampus becomes denser because it is literally allowed to heal and rebuild its networks.
It's rebuilding the hardware that the stress degraded. That is amazing.
It really is.
Now, the VBM scans also showed growth in the posterior cingulate cortex, the PCC, which is heavily involved in self-reflection and mind wandering. And then there's the temporoparietal junction, or the TPJ.
Ah, the TPJ.
Yeah, the sources say this is a region strongly associated with empathy, compassion, and understanding the perspectives of others.
And that growth in the TPJ makes total logical sense if you look at what mindfulness actually asks you to do.
How do you mean?
Well, when you meditate, you are constantly observing your own uncomfortable physical sensations or, annoying thoughts without immediately reacting to them. You are building a literal neural gap between a stimulus and your response.
Okay, I follow.
And that exact same neural machinery, that ability to detach from an immediate reactive impulse, is what allows you to hold space for someone else's perspective instead of just reacting defensively to them.
Wow. So you are physically training the circuitry of empathy.
Exactly.
They even saw changes in the cerebellum, which, traditionally was thought to just handle motor control, like your balance and coordination. But the research now shows it plays a major role in emotional regulation.
Yeah, the cerebellum does a lot more than we thought.
So in just 2 months, focused attention physically rebuilt the brain. But the research staff shows this cascade doesn't stop at the skull, right? The downstream biological impacts are massive.
Oh, absolutely. Because if the brain is physically changing to regulate emotion better, the downstream effect is a fundamentally calmer nervous system across the whole body. We see this really powerfully in the immune system.
Right. Let's talk about the flu vaccine study.
Yes. A separate landmark study by Richard Davidson and John Kabat-Zinn looked at MBSR practitioners who received a standard flu vaccine, and they found that the meditating group produced a significantly higher titer of flu antibodies than the non-meditating control group.
Wait, really? Their immune systems were demonstrably stronger just from meditating.
Just from meditating. And the cardiovascular data in these sources backs that up completely, too.
Right.
We have a systematic review showing that mindfulness interventions lead to significant reductions in pro-inflammatory biomarkers.
Things like C-reactive protein and interleukin-6.
Exactly. And it actively lowers both systolic and diastolic blood pressure.
So what's the mechanism driving that cardiovascular benefit?
It's a shift in autonomic tone. Basically, the body is stepping out of that sympathetic fight or flight mode, where your heart is pounding in traffic,
Yeah.
and it's increasing parasympathetic rest and digest activity.
Which we can actually measure through improvements in heart rate variability.
Spot on.
I was looking at how this changes our fundamental state of rest, and the sources point to the brain's default mode network, or the DMN.
Right, the DMN.
This is the network that lights up when we aren't focused on a specific task, like when our minds are just wandering, ruminating on a past argument, or, worrying about a future meeting.
Right, and you can think of an overactive DMN kind of like a car engine that is redlining while the vehicle is in park.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's burning an immense amount of fuel and causing all this wear and tear, but you aren't actually going anywhere.
Just spinning your wheels.
Exactly. But studies show that advanced meditators have significantly quieted default mode networks. They literally experience less background mental noise. Mindfulness basically teaches the brain how to properly idle, which saves the engine from burning out.
Okay, looking at all this data, we've got the denser hippocampus, the boosted flu antibodies, the lowered blood pressure, the quieted DMN, and it seems like an airtight case.
It looks fantastic on paper.
Right. We have found a scientifically proven hardware upgrading therapy. So, why is there a growing backlash in our stack of sources? Because we are seeing a massive narrative pivot happening right now among psychologists.
Yeah, and that pivot is essential to a complete understanding of the topic. You can't just look at the positive studies.
Right.
So in 2018, a highly influential paper was published in Perspectives on Psychological Science by Nicholas Van Dam and a large group of colleagues, and it was titled Mind the Hype.
Mind the Hype. Great title.
Yeah. They basically blew the whistle on the overall state of mindfulness research. They warned that the public enthusiasm and, quite frankly, the industry marketing are vastly outpacing the actual rigorous science.
Yeah, I read through Van Dam's critiques, and they point out some pretty severe methodological flaws in the broader body of research, obviously beyond the tightly controlled Holzel study we just talked about.
Right. The broader field has some real issues.
One of the biggest issues that they highlight is the heavy reliance on those waitlist control groups we mentioned earlier.
Yes. The waitlist control is a major confounding variable in these studies.
How so?
Well, imagine you put one group of people into an intensive, highly supportive 8-week program. They gather with peers, they have a compassionate instructor, they're spending hours a week on this.
Sounds nice.
Right. And then the other group sits on a wait list doing absolutely nothing.
Oh.
The intervention group might feel significantly better simply due to the placebo effect, or just the benefit of social interaction and the psychological expectation of healing.
Right, just feeling like you're doing something about your stress makes you feel better.
Exactly. So it becomes incredibly difficult to prove that the quiet breathing itself is the active ingredient, rather than just the social support they're getting.
That makes a lot of sense. And adding to that, much of the broader research relies on subjective self-reporting. People are just filling out questionnaires about how mindful they feel.
Which is notoriously unreliable.
Definitely. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
if you just spent 2 months and perhaps hundreds of dollars taking a class, you are highly incentivized to report that you feel better. You want it to have worked.
Exactly. So the science is promising, absolutely. But Van Damme's team argues it is not yet definitive enough to support the way mindfulness is being prescribed as this, like, universal cure-all.
Right.
And this scientific hype has fueled an even larger cultural phenomenon.
Yes, the corporate co-opting of the practice. We see this highlighted in the sources with Chade-Meng Tan, who was an early Google engineer. He developed a wildly popular program there called Search Inside Yourself.
Yeah, the emotional intelligence and mindfulness course.
Right. And it reportedly fills up its enrollment in like 60 seconds. Corporate America has just fully embraced the meditation trend.
Which brings us to a highly critical sociological perspective from our sources, Ron Perce's book, McMindfulness.
That's mindfulness.
Yeah, and to be totally clear to you listening, we are impartially reporting Purser's arguments here just to understand the current cultural debate. We're not endorsing a specific political stance or anything.
Exactly. We're just looking at what the critiques are. And Peirce's critique really focuses on what happens when you remove a practice from its ethical roots.
Right. Purser argues that mindfulness has basically been stripped of its original Buddhist ethical and philosophical framework. It's been commodified, packaged, and sold as what he calls a capitalist spirituality.
Capitalist spirituality. That's a strong phrase.
It is. According to his analysis, corporations are utilizing mindfulness, essentially as a tool to pacify employees.
Wow.
Yeah, he argues that instead of addressing the systemic root causes of stress, things like toxic work environments, stagnant wages, unrealistic deadlines, or, a 24/7 hyper-connected work culture corporations, just offer a 15-minute mindfulness seminar.
Right. The analogy that comes to mind is like your boss giving you a branded stress ball to squeeze while your desk is literally on fire.
Yes, that is exactly it.
Instead of bringing over a fire extinguisher to address the environment, the company treats your reaction to the fire as the actual problem.
Precisely. Purser argues this shifts the entire burden of managing stress away from the institution and places it entirely onto the individual.
It pathologizes a normal human reaction to a super unhealthy environment.
Exactly. Under this framework, if you are burning out, well, it's not because the system is fundamentally broken. It's because you personally lack emotional regulation and you just need to meditate more.
Man, it is a fascinating sociological critique. But the backlash we found in the stack goes even deeper than just corporate culture. And for me, this was honestly the most surprising twist in the entire batch of research.
The dark side.
Yes, mindfulness can actually have severe hidden adverse effects on human psychology.
Yeah, this is an area of research that is almost entirely absent from mainstream wellness marketing. You never hear about this on the apps.
No, never.
See, mindfulness was not originally designed as a secular feel-good relaxation therapy. In its traditional context, like Vipassana, it was a rigorous, often grueling tool for dismantling the ego and understanding the fundamental nature of reality.
And when you dive that deeply into the architecture of your own mind without a traditional support system, the results can be really destabilizing.
Really destabilizing.
We have research here from psychologist Willoughby Britton alongside Nicholas Van Damme showing that nearly 60% of meditators experience some kind of adverse effect.
60%, that's huge.
It's massive, and roughly a third of practitioners find those effects actively distressing.
And we're not talking about just feeling a bit bored or, restless on the cushion. The data details severe psychological events.
Like what? What are they experiencing?
Well, some practitioners experience sudden, intense panic attacks. Others have false memories or buried traumatic events suddenly surface uncontrollably, and they don't have a therapist right there to help them process it.
That sounds terrifying.
It gets worse. In more extreme cases, individuals report terrifying periods of dissociation or depersonalization.
Wait, depersonalization, like feeling detached from reality.
Exactly. They feel completely detached from their own bodies, or they start to believe reality itself is just an illusion.
Wow. But, if you look at the actual instructions of the practice, that extreme detachment sort of makes perfect sense.
Right.
Because if you spend hours intensely observing your own thoughts as, passing clouds and continually repeating the mantra that you are not your thoughts and not your feelings, well, you might eventually succeed.
Right.
You might actually fracture your sense of identity.
And in traditional Buddhist contexts, These experiences of depersonalization or the fracturing of the ego are sometimes actually recognized as advanced stages of insight.
Oh, interesting. So it's supposed to happen.
Sometimes, yes. But critically, they are navigated with the direct one-on-one guidance of an experienced teacher within a really strong ethical, philosophical, and communal framework. The practitioner has a safety net.
Right. But when you package that profound ego-dismantling psychological tool into a glossy 10-minute smartphone app and you sell it to an isolated, severely stressed out office worker, you remove the safety net entirely.
Entirely.
You are giving someone the keys to alter their brain's operating system without giving them a manual.
And the researchers in our stack are taking this so seriously that they suggest mindfulness classes and apps should actually come with explicit informed consent warnings.
Like a medical waiver.
Exactly. Similar to the waivers you sign before surgery or intense psychological exposure therapy, people need to know the documented risks before they begin.
Because it's powerful.
Right. It requires a profound respect for what this practice actually is. It is not just a warm bath for your brain. It is a potent, active psychological intervention.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together because we've covered a lot of ground. If we look at this entire journey, from the early days of Western skepticism to the VBM scans showing dense, new gray matter to the corporate boardrooms and then these warnings of depersonalization, what are the key takeaways you should really walk away with today?
I think there are three central insights here.
Okay, lay them on me.
First, the biological reality of neuroplasticity is undeniable. Mindfulness, when studied rigorously, is not just a passive mental exercise. It actively rewires your neurobiology.
Right, it sprouts new connections in regions responsible for memory and empathy. It lowers the cortisol that's suppressing your immune system, and it demonstrably improves cardiovascular health.
Exactly. But second, we must view the cultural hype with a highly critical eye. The wellness industry's marketing is moving much faster than the peer-reviewed science.
Yeah.
Many studies still suffer from weak methodologies, and we have to be careful not to treat a breathing exercise as a magical cure-all, just based on inflated headlines.
Right. And third, context is everything. Divorcing a contemplative practice from its historical and ethical roots can turn it into a corporate band-aid that basically just ignores systemic problems.
Yeah, the McMindfulness critique.
Right. Furthermore, practicing mindfulness carries real, documented psychological risks for certain individuals. It is a powerful tool, and like any powerful tool, it requires awareness, care, and sometimes professional guidance.
Taking a step back, the science we've explored today is proving the incredible, almost miraculous power of human neuroplasticity. We literally have the internal ability to shape our own hardware.
Which is incredibly empowering.
It is. But it's also a stark reminder that there are no universal silver bullets for human well-being. True wellness requires both internal resilience and external systemic health.
Like we said earlier, you can't just meditate your way out of a burning building.
You really can't. The brain is the ultimate adaptive machine. It will physically adapt to whatever we repeatedly ask of it. If we ask it to focus, to be present, and to cultivate compassion, it will build the neural architecture, step by step, to support that state of being.
But we have to be deeply intentional about how and why we are engaging in that process.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder as we close out today's investigation. We've just seen that a mere 8 weeks of focused, intentional attention can physically grow the gray matter in the learning and memory centers of your brain.
It's just 8 weeks.
So, what are the thousands of hours we spend every single year in a state of fragmented, continuous digital distraction doing to its structure?
Man, that is a question we all need to seriously investigate in our own lives.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us in the Deep Dive Lab. We love uncovering the layers of these incredible science stories with you. Make sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden mechanics of the world around us. Until then, keep questioning it. Maybe. Just breathe. Carefully.